This all started during my final year of college when I desperately needed cheaper housing. My previous lease had fallen through, and with only 2 weeks before the semester began, I knew I needed a place to stay. I found a single room available in a 3-bedroom apartment just off campus. The price was almost too good to be true. The main tenant, Liam, came across as relatively normal and polite. He was a graduate student in his mid-20s, studying something in the sciences, though he never really told me any specifics. The apartment was not the biggest and was only equipped with minimal furniture, but it appeared to be very clean, which instantly checked a box on my requirement list. The other roommate, Alex, was barely around. He worked nights at a warehouse and slept most of the day, so we would rarely see each other. Liam told me that he likes to keep to himself and doesn't like to be disturbed when he's in his room, which was totally fine for me. I asked him what happened to the previous roommate, and he said that he had moved out suddenly due to a family emergency. I didn't think much of it at the time, but thinking back now, though, I should have pushed for more information, and might have been able to prevent everything that followed. For the first month, everything went smoothly. Liam and I developed a typical roommate relationship, polite but not too close. I noticed that he ordered a lot of packages. Sometimes there were multiple in front of the door when I left the place. I thought it was weird but figured it was related to his research, or some sort of organic grocery delivery, because I had actually never ever seen Liam eat, or use the kitchen for that matter. It must have been 5 or 6 weeks of me living there when I started noticing a strange smell in the hallway of our place. If I had to describe it, I would say it was something like a chemical odor mixed with something organic and unpleasant. At first I chalked it off as being some kind of new cleaning product, but as it got stronger, I noticed it was coming from Liam's room. Over the next few days the smell got stronger, almost unbearable at that point, and I had to cover my nose every time I walked through the hallway to get to my room. I spoke to Liam about it when we met in the living room, but he just smiled and said it was related to an experiment he was conducting for one of his classes, and that it will be done soon. He walked away, and that's basically where the conversation ended before I could even respond. That evening, while I was in my room studying, I heard a loud bang, followed by what sounded like glass breaking. I opened my door, but the whole apartment was dark, except for the light coming from under the door of Liam's room. I knocked on his door to check if he was all right, but he called out that everything was fine and that I shouldn't worry. I contemplated opening the door and seeing for myself, but decided not to. I went back to my room, but for the next several hours, I could hear loud movement noises, as if he was rearranging his entire room or something. The smell became overwhelming after that incident. I started spending more time in the library and at friends' places, returning to the apartment only to sleep. I never seemed to cross paths with Liam anymore. Whenever I came home, he was in his room with the door shut and didn't come out until I left. One evening, I got home late, but still needed to do a few things for school. So I got set up at the desk in my room. I needed a pen, which I kept in the top drawer. As soon as I opened the drawer, I noticed that something was wrong. Everything in the drawer was scrambled around and out of order. On top of that, I noticed that 3 things were missing: $100 in cash, my passport, and the spare key to my room. So apart from the fact that somebody had basically gone through my stuff and robbed me, that person now also could enter my room whenever they pleased. It didn't take a genius to figure out who I suspected most behind it all. I went over to Liam's door and knocked. He didn't respond, so after a few seconds I knocked again, harder this time. I heard movement in his room, and after another few seconds, the lock clicked, and the door opened just a few inches. Liam stared through the slot, not smiling at all, and asked me what was up. I straight up confronted him and asked him if it was him who went into my room. He looked at me for a while, no emotions at all, and then said no. I told him that if he'd hand it back now, we could resolve it right then and there. But he continued to just stare at me. After a while, he smiled again and said he doesn't know what I'm talking about. I told him that I'd like to have a look around his room, but of course he declined. I told him I would alert the cops to investigate. That's when his mood completely changed, and he opened the door a few inches more and stuck his head out towards me. He told me that he doesn't like the police invading his private space for no reason, and that I would be kicked out for bringing them here. Even though it wasn't said, he was definitely threatening me at that point, so I decided to let it be and walked away. I went into my room where I locked the door and put my chair beneath the door handle. The next morning, when I was still in bed, I heard Liam's door open and shut, and him walking through the hallway and out the front door. I figured this might be my chance to get my stuff back and finally understand what it was that he was doing in his room. Liam's door was of course locked, but I remembered seeing him retrieve a spare key from above the door frame weeks earlier. I retrieved it and unlocked his door. Once I opened the door, the sight that greeted me defied any rational explanation I could imagine. The room had been completely transformed into some kind of makeshift laboratory. It honestly reminded me of a Breaking Bad scene. Tables covered with glass containers, tubes, and electronic equipment lined the walls. But it was the smell, that horrible, sweet chemical odor, that made me gag immediately. Before I had even time to process everything and look for my things, I heard the front door. Liam was back already. I managed to lock his door and put the key back just as I heard his footsteps moving towards the hallway. I rushed to my own room and closed the door, my hands shaking as I tried to appear calm and normal. For the next few hours, the apartment remained silent. I didn't hear Liam moving around, which was unusual. I decided to go out for a walk, but when I opened my door to leave, Liam was standing directly in front of me, as if he'd been waiting there. He asked where I was going, and suggested that we should talk first. There was something in his tone that made it sound less like a suggestion and more like a demand. I told him I was already late and pushed past him toward the front door. But as I reached for the handle, he placed his hand on the door, stopping me from opening it. He said we needed to discuss some things about our living arrangement. The way he spoke made it clear he knew I'd been in his room. When I tried to move his hand away from the door, he grabbed my wrist with surprising strength. His skin felt cold and clammy, and I could smell that same chemical odor emanating from him. He told me that leaving right now wouldn't be in my best interest, and that we had important matters to resolve. The threat in his voice was unmistakable. I managed to pull away from his grip and told him I'd call the police if he didn't let me leave immediately. He hesitated for a moment, but ultimately gave way and let me pass. As soon as I made it out of the building, I ran to my car without looking back. As I drove away, I looked up, and I saw him standing at the window, just staring at me and watching me leave. I never ever returned to that apartment. I contacted the police and told them everything I knew. They went round a few days later. Neither Liam nor the lab equipment in his room were found. I got in touch with the landlord, but he told me that all the information he had on Liam had turned out to be fabricated, and he had no means to contact him. I never found out what was really going on in Liam's room, but I can only speculate that he was involved in some illegal drug manufacturing business. I assume he set up in a new apartment under a new name once again. I never got my passport back, but have since applied for a new one, and reported the old one as stolen. For 3 years, I lived with my roommate Cam in a 2-bedroom apartment on the 3rd floor of an old building downtown. We weren't close by any means, but we coexisted peacefully. Cam worked the morning shift at a local coffee shop, while I had evening classes and a part-time job that kept me out most nights until around 10. Cam would usually be asleep by the time I got home, and I'd be in class when he left for work in the morning. We'd mainly see each other on weekends. Occasionally we watched a movie together, but that was it. We mainly kept to our own schedules, and that worked for both of us. One night, I came home at my usual time to find dirty dishes in the sink that hadn't been there when I left. I noticed it immediately because me and Cam had a strict rule about always tidying up after we used the common areas. I didn't want to cause a scene, so I piled the dirty dishes into the dishwasher and went to bed. I sent Cam a quick text, telling him that I had tidied up his stuff in case he was wondering. But he replied, telling me that he hadn't eaten at home the previous day. I thought his response was strange, but at the same time I thought he was maybe going through some stuff and forgot about it. A few days later, I noticed that 2 paintings that were hanging in the living room were missing. I thought this was particularly weird, because those were paintings I had brought into the apartment, and weren't cheap. Why would Cam take them down, and where had he put them? I went to knock on his door, not caring that I'd wake him. Luckily he wasn't sleeping, and he came to the door. I confronted him about the paintings, but he denied ever having touched them. He accompanied me to the living room, where he stood and gave me a confused look and told me he knew nothing, and that this was the first time seeing them missing. I didn't believe him, not one bit. But what could I do? I had no evidence that it actually was him who took the paintings. But why was he acting like he knew nothing about this? Was he hiding something? I went to bed and tried not to think about it too much. The next evening, when I had just started my shift at work, my phone started buzzing. I checked the screen and saw that it was Cam. Normally, I wouldn't answer calls at work, but I expected he might be calling with an apology and that he would return the paintings. So I excused myself from work, stepped outside, and answered. Cam asked me why I had taken all of his food, his tone slightly agitated. But I had not taken anything. I would never touch his food. We had a good thing going. My food was in the top half of the fridge, his was in the bottom. Was he trying to lure me into some sort of psychological lie, where he tried to make me believe that I was the bad guy? I told him that I would never steal his food, and annoyed that he would even accuse me, hung up the phone and went back to work. That night, I came home an hour later than usual. I didn't feel like arguing with Cam, and just wanted to go to bed. I headed straight for my room, got ready and hopped into bed, and fell asleep within a few minutes. A few hours later, sometime around 3, I was awoken by creaking floorboards, coming from somewhere in the apartment. I'm a light sleeper, so the smallest sound keeps me up at night. Luckily, Cam rarely submerges from his room during the night, but if he does, I'm always aware of it. I listened to the creaking go on for at least 5 minutes. Whatever Cam was doing, there was a lot of movement involved, almost as if he was walking back and forth from the kitchen to the living room non-stop. After another few minutes, I decided to text Cam and ask him what the hell he was doing out there in the middle of the night, and if he could at least keep it down. A minute or two later, I got a response. It read, "What do you mean? I'm not home. I'm staying at a friend's tonight." Reading this message sent chills down my body and let my heart thud so hard, I thought it was about to jump out of my chest. Whoever was in the apartment, it wasn't my roommate. I went to my bedroom door, made sure that it was locked before calling 911. It took them about 20 minutes to arrive, and once they did, there was no one else in the apartment but me. They inspected the apartment but didn't find any signs of forced entries. At that point, I started doubting myself if I had just imagined all of it. But I wasn't about to give up on it just yet. The next morning, I went to the building management office and spoke to the person in charge of the place, explaining the whole situation. The manager called me up a few hours later and told me that before Cam and I had moved in, the apartment was occupied by a man named David Chen. He had left abruptly and never went through the official process. Even though this usually triggers a changement of locks, for some reason, it was never followed up on. This meant that this David Chen guy still had keys to the place and could let himself into our apartment whenever he wanted. I immediately arranged for the locks to be changed and called the police, demanding that they check out David Chen. A few days later, they called me, telling me that they had arrested him on suspicion of robbery. They had found numerous items in his apartment that had been reported stolen. Among them were also my 2 paintings he had obtained from our place. They couldn't tell me much about the ongoing investigation, only that they believed we weren't the only apartment he had targeted. Cam was initially considered a potential accessory to the crime, but it became clear he had absolutely no involvement. Even though it turned out that he was completely innocent, it ruined our relationship in a way that we couldn't trust each other anymore. We lived together for another few months in silence before parting ways. I stopped housing with roommates, and instead lived alone for a few years before meeting my husband. I never heard from Cam again, but I hope he's doing well. In 2019, as a 26-year-old, I moved to Seattle for a job opportunity. Coming from a small coastal town, the move to the big city meant a significant increase in living costs. I went through my options, but came to the conclusion that I needed to find a roommate and share the costs. After searching through several roommate matching apps, I connected with a woman named Claire who claimed to be a grad student at the local university. Claire was 24, studying environmental science, and was looking for a quiet living arrangement where she could focus on her research. We had a video call one evening to get to know each other and make sure that we were a good match. We discussed our schedules, habits, and expectations, agreeing that we both valued our privacy but were open to occasional shared meals or activities. It seemed like a perfect match. A few weeks later, we co-signed a lease on a 2-bedroom apartment in a decent neighborhood. Claire moved in a week before me, while I was still wrapping up some stuff in my hometown. By the time I arrived, she had already set up most of the common areas with the furniture she had brought along. She welcomed me warmly and had even prepared a small welcome basket with local snacks, and we spent the first evening with a bottle of wine, enjoying our new place. Claire was quiet, clean, and considerate. Everything you could want in a roommate. She kept to herself most evenings. We'd occasionally chat over coffee in the morning or share takeout if we happened to be home at the same time. I considered myself fortunate to have found such an ideal living situation, and I guess Claire thought the same. One evening when we met in the kitchen, I mentioned a construction project I'd passed near the university's science building. Claire seemed momentarily confused before quickly agreeing that it was annoying. Later that week, she mentioned a professor who supposedly taught at the environmental science department, but when I looked up the faculty online out of curiosity, there was no record of anyone by that name. I thought it was strange, but accredited to her making up a story for small talk, so I didn't think much of it. But as time went on, I continued to notice these small inconsistencies in her stories. Claire would reference campus events that weren't on the university calendar, or mention deadlines for papers that didn't align with the academic schedule I found online. When I casually asked which building her research lab was in, she gave a vague answer about it being the new wing, before immediately changing the subject. A few days later, I decided to test Claire with a simple question about a landmark on campus that I knew didn't exist. Without hesitation, she launched into a story about spending time there, describing details about a building that was entirely fictional. I heavily contemplated telling her that I knew that what she was saying wasn't true, but decided to let it be. Maybe she had some mental health issue I wasn't aware of, and I didn't want to make things uncomfortable in our otherwise perfect living arrangement. One afternoon, I came home early from work due to a power outage at my office. As I approached our apartment door, I heard Claire speaking on the phone. I usually don't do this, but given the strange things I had picked up about Claire in the last few weeks, I decided to eavesdrop before making myself known. She wasn't speaking in her usual soft, slightly hesitant voice, but instead in a sharper, more assertive tone. I didn't pick up the whole conversation, but I did hear something along the line of, "The setup is perfect. She doesn't suspect anything. I'll have everything in place by next month." I quietly backed away from the door, my heart racing, left the apartment again, and went to a coffee shop down the street to collect my thoughts. I considered the possibility that I was overreacting. Perhaps she was planning a surprise party, or discussing some innocent matter that sounded suspicious out of context. But combined with all the inconsistencies I'd noticed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The next day, while Claire was seemingly at class, I made a visit to the university's environmental science department. I went to the secretary's office and asked where I could find a graduate student named Claire Edwards. As I suspected, the lady at the desk looked at me strangely, went through the database on her computer, before telling me that name didn't exist at the university. I also mentioned the area of her research project that she had told me about the first evening, but also there was no information to be found. I felt a cold sensation spreading through my body as I realized my roommate had been lying about her entire identity. Rather than confronting Claire immediately, I decided to investigate further. I searched her name online but found very little, just a sparse social media profile that had been created around the time we began communicating about the apartment. I called a childhood friend who worked in IT security for advice. He suggested I check whether any of my financial documents or personal identification had been tampered with. With a growing sense of unease, I carefully examined my room when Claire was out. Nothing seemed obviously disturbed, but when I checked a folder where I kept important documents, I discovered something. My passport was missing from its usual place. Now genuinely alarmed, I made sure to lock the door to my room whenever I left the apartment. I also stopped leaving my laptop and other personal documents lying around the common areas of the place. The next morning, I received a call from my bank regarding a loan application I had submitted. I told the bank this must be some mistake, as I had made no such application. But the person on the phone checked and confirmed that someone had applied for a substantial loan in my name, using my social security number and other personal details. I contacted the police immediately, explaining that I was falling victim to identity theft. I told them that even though I had no evidence, I suspected my roommate to be involved. They advised me not to confront Claire, but to continue gathering evidence while they initiated an investigation. Over the next few days, I maintained a pretense of normalcy while documenting everything. I discovered that Claire was almost never where she claimed to be. The university library had no record of her student ID being used, and she wasn't attending the classes she mentioned. Instead, according to the location sharing on a fitness app we both used, she spent significant time at various cafes and public libraries throughout the city. A week into the investigation, I received a call from a detective. They had identified Claire as not being the woman she claimed to be. She went by the name of Emma Blackwood, a woman with multiple established identities who was wanted in 3 states for identity theft and fraud. She would find roommates with good credit scores and stable incomes, move in with them, gradually collect their personal information, and then open credit accounts in their names. By the time her victims discovered the fraud, it was often too late, and they had already been scammed by thousands and left in debt. The police advised me to make up an excuse of a family affair and stay elsewhere for a few days, while they prepared an arrest warrant. I packed an overnight bag and went to stay with a colleague and left a note on the kitchen table. 2 days later, officers arrested Emma as she was returning to our apartment. In her possession were fake IDs with my photograph, credit cards in my name, and even a notarized document that would have given her access to my retirement accounts. When the police searched her room, they found a locked cabinet containing equipment for creating other fraudulent documents, as well as identification and financial information belonging to multiple other people, presumably her previous roommates. I told the police that I had heard her speaking to somebody on the phone, assuming that at least one other person is involved in this whole thing. They thanked me and told me they would look into it. However, I never heard if anything came from it. After Emma's arrest, I moved to a studio apartment despite the financial strain. The experience left me with lasting anxiety about sharing my living space, and years later, I still shred every document with personal information and check my credit report monthly. What frightens me most is how easily Emma integrated herself into my life, how convincingly she played the role of the perfect roommate while systematically preparing to steal my identity. I'm so glad that I caught on to her before she could do any damage to me. Otherwise, my life could have turned out quite differently.